Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Freilich Project's Research Showcase. My name is Melissa Lovell. I'm Research Fellow and convener of the Freilich Project for the study of bigotry here at the Australian National University. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce and to welcome today some fine researchers who we've been fortunate enough to support as part of our ECR small grant scheme. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the research that you've all been doing. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and the country that Chris and I are sitting on here today. So it's the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people of the Canberra region. And of course, all of you are also sitting on Aboriginal land, never ceded here in our Australian countryside. So I won't speak too long myself, but I'd just like to briefly introduce each of our speakers. They have 5 minutes each to talk about their research projects. Chris is going to give them a little warning at 5-minute mark if necessary. 6 projects, 5 minutes each, and there will be longer seminars for most of our presenters on our schedule of seminars coming up over the course of 2023 if you're interested in finding out a little bit more. Our first presenter today is Maquarie on a project called Motivated Prejudice behind the perpetual foreigner syndrome. So Michael, I'll hand things over to you.
Can everyone see my slides? Awesome. So I just also wanted to just briefly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which all of us are zooming in today. I pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and I recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So today I'm going to be just briefly talking about some of the work that I've been doing looking at the perpetual foreigner syndrome and exploring the factors that sort of facilitate the stereotyping of people as not truly belonging to the nation they were born and raised in. And so we know from the literature that national identity is an important part of self-concept, and this is true irrespective of your race or ethnicity. But national identity, of course, is not equally ascribed to all races and ethnicities. And in fact, the research shows that both on an implicit and an explicit level, many Western nations, such as Australia, are defined by a white identity. And when in our own research, when we've asked people who they consider the most Australian, it's always the case that to be the most Australian means to be white. And so minorities experience then this national identity denial a lot that comes out of everyday interactions such as this, where you might be asked, where are you from? You might say Australia, and that question might be followed up with, no, where are you really from? And then we see it also just online in every aspect of our lives. This was a cover photo posted by Qantas. And of course, you have the obligatory national identity denial going on in the comments here. And so the research shows that national identity denial, or this perpetual foreigner syndrome, has negative effects on psychological well-being of ethnic minorities. A lot of this has been done in the United States, and I've got some work showing this in Australia as well. And so I wanted to ask, is there any way that we could shift these national identity perceptions? And I thought perhaps signs of, cultural immersion can bolster perceptions of ethnic minorities' national identity. And so in an early study we ran, Australian participants were assigned to see either an Asian or white target who was depicted as being either hyper-Australian or not. So in the control condition, you just saw that their race, basically, without any information about their interests. But then in the hyper-Australian condition, they had very, stereotypically Australian interests, Vegemite, AFL, etc. And our key DV in this study was their perceived Australian identity. And this is what we found. So we saw that, saying that you like all this Aussie stuff does help in terms of bolstering your Australian identity if you're Asian. but not to the extent that you're considered on, equivalently to white targets in terms of your Australian identity. So we expected the discrepancy in the control condition when all you have is race information, but we didn't expect this discrepancy right here. Even a culturally immersed Asian target is seen as significantly less Australian than a culturally immersed white target. And in fact, no more Australian than a white target without any cues to their Australian identity whatsoever. So we found that Asian people depicted as culturally immersed are considered more Australian than Asian people who are not, and Asian people depicted as culturally immersed are still considered less Australian than white people depicted in the same way. And a follow-up study where we manipulate our birthplace actually found the same discrepancy. And so I wanted to know, is this race discrepancy a result of automatic processing or motivated bias? So if you have negative attitudes towards multiculturalism, you would be motivated to actually deny ethnic minorities their national identity. So in a follow-up study, what we did was recruited Australian participants and had them see either a hyper-Australian Asian target or a hyper-Australian white target, basically what you saw before. And we measured their attitude towards multiculturalism to see if it would moderate the effect of that manipulation on perceived Australian identity. And we saw the same discrepancy overall. But if we broke it down and we separated people in terms of their attitude towards multiculturalism, you see that the discrepancy only emerges when people have negative attitudes towards multiculturalism or at mean levels. But with high levels of attitudes towards more positive attitudes towards multiculturalism, you saw that discrepancy disappear. And so we show that people with positive attitudes towards multiculturalism do not evaluate culturally immersed Asian and white Australians differently in national identity, which suggests that national identity denial may at least partly be motivated by prejudice. And I would like to thank all the students who've worked with me on this, as well as other collaborators. And thank you for listening. Hopefully I've made it under 5 minutes. Okay.
Thanks, Michael. I didn't hear a little buzzer, so I think that's well under the 5. Well done. Thanks for being such a good role model for everybody. I should have mentioned before, but if we have time for any questions, we'll be taking those through the Q&A function. So, please feel free to put those in as we go, and we'll hopefully have time for a couple of those at the end. So our next project, so we have Christina Kenny and Matt Allen presenting on behalf of their project team for their project towards hetero-optimism. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got today.
Thanks, Melissa. I was just noting the time for reference. And thank you, Michael. That was a really stimulating presentation. I think looking at the list of other speakers today and other projects, our project, I think, seems quite quiet. It's something that happens, or it's a phenomenon that we've observed, I guess, in a kind of a theoretical or a sort of a cultural sense, rather than doing running a series of studies on it, although that might be something we consider in the future. But hetero-pessimism, we sort of tried to frame it, in a positive or kind of a more constructive way. But hetero-pessimism is an idea it's a new word for an intuitive and possibly much older concept in white Western culture, certainly. But it was coined in 2019 by the writer Asa Sarrazin. And Sarrazin describes hetero-pessimism essentially as an attitude of disappointment, embarrassment, or despair at the state of heterosexual relations, and especially about being in such a heterosexual relation. Sarrazin's definition is particularly useful, we thought, because it's a pessimism that's accompanied by the paradoxical practice of sticking with heterosexuality in its current forms, even as the people who are participating in these forms regard it to be irredeemable. So we read Asa's piece, and it resonated with a lot of us. I think as we kind of started to talk more about the project amongst our colleagues and friends, a lot of people would kind of say, oh my God, like there's a word for that now. Or, I didn't realize that I could talk about my husband in this way. And it was like a cultural, it was kind of encapsulated by this cultural experience. And so we decided to kind of explore through a series of interviews and a kind of a public facing or outward facing conversation how people thought about heteropessimism, whether they thought it was a useful concept. And we decided to do, because we're an interdisciplinary group of people, so it's, sorry, I should have started with an acknowledgement of country. So Matt and I are coming from, calling to you today from Armidale, which is the country of the Anawan people, who share the caring responsibilities for country with the Ngambanya, Gamilaroi and Dangari nations. And we're here with our colleagues on this project, Felicity Joseph, Jennifer Hamilton and Daz Chandler, our amazing producer, who's based in Newcastle. So all of us have different specialities and different intellectual interests. And so we decided to kind of interview people within and outside the academy to understand more about whether heteropessimism resonated within their own bodies of work, and whether it was a useful concept that we could take forward and not just kind of be mired in, you know, in the kind of morass of heteropessimism itself, which is a kind of a closed system of regret, frustration, you know, but recommitment all the time in this kind of circle. So it's a public-facing research project, and one of the ways that we engage with the public, in addition to the podcast and the website, which I'll show you in a moment, is that we wrote an article for The Conversation called "What is Heteropessimism and Why Do Men and Women Suffer from It?" The comments are, I don't know if you're more optimistic than me, but I guess we weren't surprised by the comments. And Matt wrote a response blog, I guess, to the kind of character of the comments, which kind of commented on the fact that we look too young to be in long-term heterosexual relationships. Everybody in the comments assumed that we were heterosexual, but that we didn't have anything to say that was meaningful about it. A lot of men reported back to us in the comments that their wives were very happy. Thank you very much. And that on that basis, what would we have to offer, you know, their particular kind of instance or expression of heterosexuality?
I might just jump in there, Christina,
Sure.
quickly. Just I think that defensiveness is you know, and this is one of the things I said in my response. That defensiveness is really in many ways evidence of exactly what we're talking about. But one of the things that attracts me to this project and this concept is that it's a concept that applies to all genders, and cuts across gender in some ways, which I think some other conceptual languages don't do so effectively. Male heteropessimism is very different from female, but they're symbiotic of each other. And there certainly are, there's skepticism about marriage and commitment, and what's at stake in it in both genders, and it kind of feeds off each other. So that's part of my interest in this kind of in this concept, and part of what we're trying to bring out through our research.
Got about 30 seconds left.
Great. Well, in the last 30 seconds, I'll just run through. So that's the website that we've put together. It's called The Heteropessimists. You can see that the podcast, I've just navigated away from it. The podcast is here with the interviews with different people. We interviewed Professor Frank Bongiorno from ANU, Professor Jane Ward from Gender and Sexuality Studies in the University of California. I interviewed a male dom based in Melbourne to talk about professional, I guess, the commercialization of masculinity and the ways that that might feed into or relate to heteropessimism and heteropessimist ideas. And we're also planning to record a second series of podcasts later this year, for which we've got further funding. So thank you so much for the Freilich Foundation for kind of seeding this project in such a generative way. And we're seeking to kind of, in this second iteration, explore through a similar kind of set of mechanisms, the utility of heteropessimism as a concept in First Nations, migrant, diaspora, and post-colonial scholarship and communities. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Matt. And I encourage people to go and have a look at that website and listen to the podcast. There's some really fascinating stuff there. So plenty for people to go and, excuse me, follow up on. So thank you there. Our third project, Being the Other in the War on Terror, Race, Gender and Bigotry in Western Militaries since 9/11. Mia Martin Hobbs will be presenting in this project.
Thanks very much. I will just screen share. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. Thanks for having me. It's just with the first two, it's fabulous to hear about all the different research that's been happening here. It's really interesting. So thanks for holding this showcase. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri lands in Naarm. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. My project investigates the experiences of women and minority soldiers in the Australian, American and British militaries in the War on Terror. The War on Terror saw the most diverse soldier force ever deployed by Western militaries, and these soldiers fought in a deeply racialized and gendered war. Political leaders tapped notions of feminism and pluralism to justify the wars as liberation, while military policies dehumanized enemies, allies, and civilians alike. Women soldiers developed a niche role as the first line of communication with civilian women confined to their homes, but at the same time, the gender of women soldiers was weaponized. It was used to degrade and violate detainees in military prisons. And these race and gender dynamics are really complicated by the epidemics of racism and sexual violence that soldiers experienced within Western militaries. So through a transnational oral history project, I aim to understand these soldiers' experiences as victims and perpetrators of gendered and racialized violence. I believe that listening to the experiences of soldiers who have witnessed and waged this violence will offer new ways of thinking about the anti-terror project. Now, I was very fortunate to receive a Freilich ECR small grant toward my project in 2019. This project, the award supported the first phase of the project, which was the scoping of existing interview archives with women and minorities among the US Armed Forces, and also allowed me to present my work at the Oral History Association in October last year. One of the collections that I investigated using this funding was the Iraq Experience Project from the US Institute of Peace Oral Histories Project. The Institute of Peace is a think tank that has very close ties to the US government. Its board includes the US Secretaries of Defense and State. And the Institute of Peace conducted interviews with military and civilians and contractors who deployed for a lessons learned type project about the Iraq War in the latter half of 2004. Now, this is an interesting time, the time at which the interviews were conducted. There's still very widespread faith among the interviewees about the Iraqi mission, optimism about the Iraqi elections upcoming, but there's also concern regarding the growing insurgency, deteriorating security conditions, and of course, falling support for the war in the US. There were 35 interviewees in the archive, but only 6 met my criteria of being a woman of any background or a minority man. Of the 6, there were 3 women and 3 men. All the women were white. Among the men, there was a Navajo man, an African-American, and an Iraqi expat. Using in vivo, I analyzed interview transcripts and coded prominent themes. I focused in particular on signs of empathy or cultural competence in what Lele Khalili calls the seam of the encounter. This is moments of interaction between the US military and occupied Iraqi populations, and looking specifically at expressions of emotion there. There's this theory in security studies that a military will be more effective, that they're better equipped if they're diverse, especially in counterinsurgency contexts. This theory has made its way into the military doctrine of the US, Australia, and the UK, specifically for the War on Terror. I call this diversity doctrine. Something I'm exploring is if it actually works, if the skills and strengths from a diverse military can do any good if they're operating in contradiction with the broader mission of the military. I agree with Derek Gregory's characterization of the War on Terror as a neo-colonial project that positions the people and places of the Middle East as something to be feared or something to be controlled. So I'm interested in whether women and minority soldiers reproduce this bigotry, this view of the population as something to be feared and controlled, or whether their identity-based experiences give them a different view of things. What I found was that most of the interviewees identified a lack of cultural preparation and awareness by the US military. They recognized that the US had underestimated the challenges of reconstruction, and they drew on their experiences to empathize with Iraqis. Women soldiers compared their experience being patronized as a woman in the military to the way their fellow soldiers treated local Iraqis, for example. So there's an understanding of Iraqi resentments and frustrations with the US occupation. But they also upheld a deeper faith in the US mission of nation building. That they really believed in this idea of the US as the appropriate leader in the region.
About 30 seconds, sorry.
Okay, thanks. This faith translated into a general mistrust of Iraqis. There was this sense that Iraqis were at fault for the rising security concerns. So there's a tension between the empathy they felt and their commitment to the broader neo-colonial mission. This small interview bank lays the groundwork for the larger project. I'm curious as to how different archives and my own interviews might challenge the Institute of Peace archive on Iraq. how UK and Australian veterans might differ in their views of that conflict. And I want to find out about experiences across time as well as place, examining the experiences of soldiers who deployed across the Middle East, South Asia, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and across the whole 2 decades of the War on Terror. Thanks to the support from Freilich, I had the groundwork from this project to submit for DECRA, so hopefully the project will continue to grow. Thank you.
Thanks, Mia. Great to see the project growing from its initial form, and I'm sure we all wish you the very best with that DECRA application. We'll have our fingers crossed for you.
Thank you.
I'd like to next introduce Daozhi, who will be presenting on Indigenous people in Chinese Australian newspapers between the years 1894 and 1912, so Chinese perspectives.
Thank you very much. Please allow me to share my screen with you. Yep, that's it. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Daozhi people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which Maquarie University is built. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. My project examines Chinese Australian newspapers published between 1894 and 1912 to provide a better understanding of Chinese perspectives on Indigenous affairs and on Indigenous people. It helps to address the bigotry in the public discourse that has excluded the Chinese Australian community, as well as other non-European immigrants, from the debates on Indigenous issues and from the national reconciliation with Indigenous people. Chris, could you please move to the next screen? Thank you. The Chinese language newspapers I analysed include the Chinese Australian Herald, which was the first Chinese language newspaper in Sydney with a national circulation. The second one is Donghua News, which was also launched in Sydney and later changed its name to Donghua Times. And the third is the Chinese Times, published in Melbourne in 1902 under the Chinese name Ai Guo Bao and then Jingdong Xinbao. Let me give you 2 examples. Chris, could you please? Yep. On February the 25th, 1898, the Chinese Australian Herald published a news report which defended a Chinese migrant, a Chinese man who was charged with employing Indigenous labor without permission. The report noted that Port, which is the Chinese name for Thursday Island, including the land and the adjacent waters, has belonged to Black people. The British occupied the land, took it as their own, and stripped the rights of Black people. This is one of the striking examples of written evidence showing that Indigenous ownership of ancestral lands and territorial seas prior to the European settlement had long been recognized by the Chinese in Australia. The report opposed the ruling of the Chinese and the injustices suffered by the Indigenous people. At the end of the report, it called on the Chinese sojourners to return home. So indeed, Indigenous and Chinese people have established enduring relationships over centuries, yet many details of these interactions remain unknown to the Australian public. The second example is an image. Thank you, Chris. The Chinese Times published a column called Australian Affairs, occasionally along with an image, as you can see here. It consists of 3 Chinese characters called 澳洲市, meaning Australian Affairs, indicating the title of the column, and an illustration showing an Indigenous man on a bended knee holding a wine map in the shape of Australia. Perhaps this is the earliest sketch of Indigenous Australian published by the Chinese. There were few illustrations in the then early Chinese language newspapers due to the cost of page space, but this image appeared in the Chinese Times for at least 4 times between 1907 and 1910. It was at a time when the White Australia policy and racialized ideology prevailed. To use an Indigenous figure to represent Australia was bold and progressive. The novelty of this striking image lies in its attempt to rectify the dominant representation of Australia as white and to make it clear that the white Australia has an indelible Black history. This research is supported by Freilich project funding, which I'm really, really grateful. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that presentation. I have to admit that I'm one of those people who know absolutely nothing about the relationship between Australia's First Nations people and Chinese people. It's really fascinating to hear, and I look forward to reading more from your project as well. Our 5th of 6 projects will be presented by Ellen Cho. Her subject is Everyday Terrorism, the story of a Korean victim survivor of domestic and family violence in Australia.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, that's good. Thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the people of Kulin Nation's traditional custodians of the lands on which I present today. And I also like to pay my respect to their elders past and present. So this was one of the first grants that I received as I joined academia last year, and I'm very grateful for the support. Today, I'm going to show you some snapshots of the RE project and also talk about how I try to translate my research knowledge into action, obviously with the support of this grant. So as you can see from the screen, I made a 3-part video series based on one of my PhD thesis chapters, which tells the story of a Korean victim survivors of domestic and family violence. So each video is 2 to 7 minutes long and has captions in Korean, English, and or Chinese. And the narration was in Korean. So all 3 parts of the video series were different. The first part was is animation, and the second one is a K-pop style music video, and the third part is a dance video. And each part shows the pre, during, and post-crisis period of Ari's lived experience of domestic and family violence. So through this project, we aim to raise awareness of domestic and family violence issues in Australia because victim survivors and their children are often further marginalized in our society. And we also made these videos available for anyone to use for the educational and training purposes. And you can check the project website, which I will provide in the chat now. And given the time limit, I'll just quickly go into discuss what we actually we as the production team have actually done. So the first part of the video series is an animation that highlights Ari's migration journey to Australia, and it also explains how she met her violent partner. And for part 2, which is the main part of the series, we wanted to express the barriers she experienced leaving the relationship, as well as her resilience and determination to leave the perpetrator. The video is 7 minutes long, so I can't really show it to you now. So you can probably check that on our website. The reason why we did this was many media and other platforms describe Asian migrant women as passive victims who have little language ability to navigate the system, which often leads to blaming them for not leaving the perpetrators. So we really wanted to show their agency, their resilience through this video, and also the complexity of being a migrant woman and mother to a child who often has a lot to consider before leaving the perpetrators. And the last part of the series, oh, it's not moving. In the last part, what we did was we in the dance video, it begins with Ari taking her suitcase in a large, empty, rundown room, which is contrasted by her new environment, a warm, sunlit room. So through this part, you can just see the sketch over there, but what we wanted to do was highlight the mixed feeling of victim survivors. And things like post-crisis, anxiety, relief, and freedom, to give the audience the message that it doesn't really end by leaving the violent relationship. Victim survivors continue to experience many barriers and challenges throughout navigating the post-crisis period, and that's what we wanted to highlight. So we had 2 pre-screening sessions, one in Korean and another one in English, which attracted 100 registrations. And our project was covered in Australia and South Korea. The videos were later introduced and used by other multi-ethnic, multicultural groups, such as the Chinese Australian Practitioners Working Group. And this is an ongoing project. We are really interested in co-designing or even co-producing the ARI project too with victim survivors and their children. We really need to think about ethics application again. Hello, ethics committee. That's something that we are really interested in doing. And as a follow-up study, my colleague, Dr. Angela Viora, and I conducted interviews with those who have been involved in producing the ARI project, so they can tell us a little bit more about their experience with this project and their views on the impact and importance of this public scholarship. So we are currently analyzing this data, and we look forward to hearing the findings with you soon. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And I hope many of our audience go and watch the videos in full. So thanks very much. I'd just like to flag that we're coming up to our final presentation. So if people have been, if these presentations have led people to have any questions, please consider putting them in the Q&A function. We'll be getting to that very shortly. And I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Eva Glisic, who will be presenting on the art of justice in the Western Balkans. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about my research today. I will just share my screen now. I hope you can see that. Okay. Terrific. So thank you. I'm zooming in today from the traditional lands of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past and present. So my work explores the relationship between art and politics, with a particular focus on forms of artistic activism in Russia and Eastern Europe. So this project examines contemporary political or activist art that engages with the legacy of ethno-nationalist violence in the Western Balkans. So this is a term that encompasses countries in Southeastern Europe that are not EU members. And I'm focusing here specifically on Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the focus of this work is placed really in the ways in which war crimes that followed the dissolution of socialist Yugoslavia in 1991 have been interpreted in contemporary artistic production in this region. Now, the violent collapse of socialist Yugoslavia in the early 90s continues to cast a long shadow. And 30 years on, the region remains, in a sense, a contested territory of personal memories and traumas that cannot be or are forbidden from being publicly expressed. And this silence is in part enforced in order to avoid acknowledgement of wartime atrocities, which political elites in successor states would rather ignore. But equally unwelcome are accounts of the socialist past of the country that evoke memories of this common Yugoslav identity and supranational solidarity and emancipatory politics that really define this Yugoslav project. Instead, the ruling officials continue to place emphasis on a form of remembrance that champions patriotic readings of national history and promotes highly conservative values. But the efforts to control these narratives and to edit history have consistently been opposed, and often by individuals and groups operating within the sphere of art. And I want to talk today just about one example. This is the Four Faces of Omarska working group, which is really a paradigmatic example of this type of practice. So Four Faces of Omarska working group is a Belgrade-based interdisciplinary art collective that brings together participants from the domain of art, architecture, film, political science, law, and philosophy. And this is really an artistic turn activist archipelago comprising individuals and teams that are bound really by a single cause. And this is investigation of the atrocities that were committed during the conflict that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 90s through a study of a single site. So the study of Omrska, which is located in the northwestern corner of Bosnia, and they see this place as a microcosmos of this experience. Now, the four phases that from their title really refer to four narratives that they treat through their practice. So first is the history of the Omrska site, which during socialist era was a mining complex. And by focusing on this layer of history, they want to emphasize the secular, supra-ethnic, multicultural welfare state that, and that history of Yugoslavia, and really promote this memory of Yugoslav project, where in fact these different communities did live together. The second layer is the story of the Omrska camp. So during the war in 1990s, this is transformed into a detention camp where some of the worst atrocities took place. Today, this is again a mining complex, but in the ownership of a multinational corporation that forbids any kind of building of a memorial that will commemorate victims and survivors of the camp. And by foregrounding this layer of story, the group seeks to kind of expose the role of global capital in advancing the politics of denial in the name of profit. And the fourth layer is the story of the way that this is used today as a site, or very recently, to film a blockbuster film that promotes particularly this kind of nationalist view of history, celebrates a victory, a Serbian victory in the First World War, without any kind of acknowledgement of the recent atrocities that took place there. And so the camp was used by Serbian paramilitaries for mass execution of non-Serbian population and political prisoners. So what this group is really trying to do is, through their artistic practice, highlight all these layers of history of the site, and to keep this complex history at the center of public discussion, to resist official editing out of inconvenient episodes from the past, and to oppose the politics of silence. There are two kind of key questions that this group asks. The first is, how does the site of atrocity become one of knowledge production based on solidarity? Omrska is a place that saw conflict between three dominant religious and ethnic groups, Serbian, Croatian, and Bosniak. And the question is, how do we restore communication between these communities and seek justice for the victims and after events that took place on this side? And the question, second question is really, this being a group that operates from Serbia, a country that was the aggressor in this conflict. The question they ask is, can artists speak out against the war from within the aggressor country? And if so, how? And this is an incredibly important question today. And we see specifically, Russian artists today struggling with the same kind of question in their response to the events taking place in Ukraine. So this is at the core of this project. And I'm grateful for the Freilich support to investigate what has been a really tricky and difficult subject matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, and thank you to all our presenters, both for sharing your knowledge and expertise, but also for keeping to our 5-minute limit. We now have approximately 15 minutes or so for questions, if we have any questions. Please add them to the Q&A, and of course, if you're one of our panelists asking a question to another panelist, you can just speak. I've already got you here up on the screen.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So look, all fascinating project from everyone, but I was really interested, Daozhi, in your project and your research, and I was just interested in how you're identifying articles and finding them. Obviously, I'm an Australian historian, and we're all very familiar with working with Trove, which makes potentially finding things very easy, but I imagine it's much more difficult with Chinese language newspapers. I'm just kind of interested in the methodology you're using.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for your question. In terms of the methodology, well, my method is quite straightforward. Just go to Trove and find the relevant and just type in the relevant keywords.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So
Tremendous help.
yeah, great. Okay, but can you search Chinese language paper? Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't realize that. That's amazing.
But there are a lot of difficulty. One of the difficulty is how to identify Black people from Indigenous Australians. And I do find the then Chinese confused Black people, Indigenous people, as well as Pacific Islanders. They're all mixed up together as Black people at times, so that relies on the context to distinguish one from the other. So far from, I'm looking into the body of Chinese Australian newspapers published from 1894 to 1937. And from what I have found, roughly around 135 articles with references to Indigenous people or Indigenous issues. So these are the articles that I'm looking into to see what they're talking about and what kind of perspectives that they have on Indigenous people and Indigenous matters at that time. The project itself is actually, I should say that the body of works are far more messy than the examples that I present to you. A lot of racist remarks included in the newspapers at that time. And one of my job is to finding why and to understand the historical background and the Chinese perspectives at that time. So my research actually goes a lot beyond that. I'm looking into the Chinese publication from 1840s to the end of 19th century to understand how and why Australians view Indigenous people in that way.
Fascinating. I'd be really interested to know, I don't want to take up too much time here, but I'd be really interested to hear as well about perhaps in future research that you publish, but about whether there are differences between the kind of diasporic attitudes to Indigenous people and perhaps attitudes in mainland China, or if there's even any understanding in mainland China.
Yeah, they're different, but there are a lot of similarities.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for your question.
I actually have a question for Christina and Matt. I'm interested in this podcast that you've produced, and I'd be interested to hear which interview is your favorite one and why. Perhaps it's the most surprising, or I don't know. I would be interested to find out.
I think I don't know, Matt. I think
I really like, I'll just say I really like Felicity's interview.
Yeah.
It's really great working with a philosopher. I don't have any training in philosophy. Some philosophers who I've encountered are very obscure and difficult to understand. Felicity is not one of those people. She is really conceptually rigorous, but very good at explaining them. And so it's really helped me to think about the concepts involved and their relationship to other kinds of ideas. So I found that a very useful interview.
Yeah, that was Felicity's interview with Professor Jane Ward. So it was a real meeting of the minds. Felicity is an existential philosopher, so she's done a lot of work on Beauvoir and was a kind of a perfect fit. I mean, that's why we kind of made the collective, but that was, yeah, I agree. That was a fantastic, I mean, they're all good. I guess I don't usually sprig my own work so egregiously, but I do really like the interview that I did, partly because it was so left field for an academic collective. And I just, in my other work, I do sort of a lot of work with communities, rural communities in Kenya and Samoa. And as I kind of get into my career a bit more, I just want to go back to, I mean, I really love theory as an intellectual pursuit, and that's why I became, one of the reasons I wanted to become an academic. But I think that these kinds of perspectives that are outside the academy are really critical, and I really enjoy, and I think it's really critical to bring them into discussions that we might be having, like in these little, I mean, not that academic discussions are only valid if they're legible externally, but I do think that a concept like heteropessimism is what is popular, or is popularized, I guess, in some ways. And so to kind of find someone to talk to who has thought really deeply about kind of his own his own masculinity, his own sexuality, and then to sort of enter into the capitalist market of that, and then come back around and kind of talk about what heteropessimism has to offer, or has as a kind of value proposition. I thought was it was really fun. I mean, maybe it's just because it was a really fun interview, but yeah, it also was like a different perspective. I think that that not many people hear about. I do a lot of in my teaching, I sort of teach sex, gender, and social change type subjects. So for me, it was like a good intersection of a lot of different interests.
Thanks. Eva, you have a question?
Yeah, just to follow up really on that, I'm interested how you select your interviewees for podcast.
It was just we all just made this wish list of people that we would really love to talk to, and then hope that they would say yes. So I guess, I mean, it was kind of we all had different come from different disciplines, so we all had different kind of people. So Jennifer Hamilton interviewed Sophie Lewis, who wrote who's written a lot about rather provocatively sounding the abolition of the family, which kind of and Full Surrogacy Now, I think, is her other book title. So she's kind of talking about really radical reimaginings of the nuclear family, a kind of really pushing kind of a queer theory approach to combusting the kind of like capitalist drive kind of for kind of nuclear families and productivity, and the ways that we care for each other, care for children. So Jen's work is on domesticities and ecological feminism. So that was, Sophie and her had a fantastic chat. Matt interviewed a historian, Frank Bongiorno, Felicity interviewed a philosopher, and I interviewed a sex worker. But they all kind of spoke to our own work, I guess. So I guess part of the project was it had to kind of resonate with our own work, just because we didn't have time to kind of build a whole new kind of edifice for the project. So it kind of had to resonate with parts of our work that was already in place, or that would push our own kind of thinking in particular ways. Yeah, but we're keen for suggestions. I mean, if you have someone who I mean, I think in a way heterosexuality, I think, I mean, really, like a lot of these panelists have been talking about, wartime or surviving atrocity or domestic violence. And I think heteropessimism, as we've kind of entered into it, has been a bit of a fun, or like a soft entry, if you like, sort of feeding on a kind of a cultural trope that can be amusing or a bit demeaning. But I think it does have resonance for the ways that post-conflict societies rebuild. I know in my own work in Kenya after independence, a lot of my post-PhD work was on the creation and recreation of gender, and the remaking of family in the aftermath of independence. And I think heteropessimist, you could take that, that's actually the next part of the project, is to kind of do much more kind of post-colonial theoretical work around family building and family kind of reproduction in those contexts. So sorry, I'll stop talking. It's just a very generative set of papers.
Thanks, Christina. Any other questions? I don't see any coming in, so I'll wrap things up. I would like to thank Chris Marcatilli, Project Officer, for coordinating this session. So thanks very much, Chris.
Pleasure.
We really appreciate your efforts. I'd just like to say to our audience that if you'd like to find out more about any of these projects, there is information on the Freilich Project website. We also have a blog that many of our researchers have contributed to, or will be contributing to later in this year. So please go and have a read through that as well. And of course, we will be having seminars throughout this year, more in-depth seminars, where you'll be able to hear more about these wonderful research projects. To keep up to date about those, there are details on our website. Of course, we'll be sending details out closer to the dates on via our newsletter and via social media. So we're on Twitter, Mastodon, and LinkedIn. If you'd like to follow us, we'd love to have you follow us and to continue these conversations. Finally, I'd just like to once again thank all of our speakers. I hope everybody has enjoyed the sort of fast and fabulous format. I know I certainly have. So thank you all, and I hope you have a fantastic afternoon.